Previously, on Anon's epic adventure, we'd just left off with Anon sneaking back to his cabin to get supplies to keep him alive while playing fugitive. However, he ran into Lith. Managing to defeat him with fire and ice spam, he revived him just as he slipped out the door, leaving him frozen in place and leaving Anon safe to retreat into the woods. By now, it was late in the afternoon. With food obtained, I decided I'd do the next easiest thing, which was to find a place to sleep and to leave my stuff. That may be one of the better things about LARPing, I think. When playing a tabletop role-playing game, carrying gear and sleeping meant absolutely nothing, to the point where I wouldn't even keep track of it. At a LARP, you learn to appreciate being able to ignore those things. Here, I would have a hard time escaping any pursuers if I had to carry a sleeping bag filled with food while doing so, and while sleeping in the woods with just my sleeping bag was a possibility, I wasn't going to do it if I didn't have to. Besides the cabins that were scattered about the campground, there were other small buildings and sites, like picnic grounds with tables that might be better to sleep at. My first choice would be to find a cabin that had been left unassigned, but this was also the most risky. It would be a really bad scene to think a cabin was unoccupied and then find out it wasn't. Even so, the exciting prospect of sleeping in an equipment shed or outhouse wasn't enough to dissuade me from taking that risk. Traveling far away from the inn to the cabins I assumed they would assign last, I found myself encountering less and less people and having to hide less and less often. The people who were pursuing me, who I assumed was everyone considering the size of my bounty, really didn't seem keen on doing a good job looking for me. They were just patrolling around the main roads, not bothering to poke around in the smaller ones, let alone the woods. With the whole campground to look over, I realized that within the outskirt reaches, I could basically move around without really having to fear being found. I stalked several cabins, watching them from a distance. When it seemed like no one was around, I'd run up, check to see if there were any signs of people staying there, and if I saw bags lying around, I'd go to the next cabin. Finally, just as it was getting dark, I found a cabin that was well detached from all the others. Peering inside, I saw that there was no sign anyone had been in there. As I tried the front door and found it locked, I began to wonder if what I was about to do was going to be considered unlawful entry. I tried one of the windows, which were almost rustic with their simplicity, and opened it without difficulty. Inside, it was a fairly bare beyond wooden bed frames with plastic-wrapped mattresses, but there was a small kitchen and bathroom. After relieving myself and getting a nice drink of the tap water, I located a closet. Inside, it was not very large, but there was enough room for me to sleep in it if I slept in the fetal position. While sleeping on a mattress would be infinitely more comfortable, I wasn't going to be taking any more chances than I already was. But now was not the time to even consider sleeping, so I just downed a few more snacks, put my gear in the closet, and left through the window. It was getting fairly dark, which was to my advantage. I've always had good night vision, meaning the poor light would only serve to hide me from my enemies. While I never prided myself on being stealthy, I guess that might have been because I had never had a chance to test myself. Even now, though, I still wouldn't consider it to be one of my skills, considering that the people I was sneaking around were often obviously not looking for anyone. It seemed that most people had given up on actively searching for me, which made my life all the easier. However, it didn't solve my major problem. I had decided to take a weapon from the cave. Moving towards it, I determined my earlier fears had not been misguided. Were it not for the darkness, I probably would have been quickly discovered and attacked by the monsters that wandered around near it. They were constantly actively searching for people. Not just for me, as it was common for weak players to hide from the monsters at night. I pressed my luck, and was rewarded as I reached the cave without being found. Stepping inside the large cabin, I was relieved to find the main room empty, and the large piles of weapons exactly as I remembered them. Perhaps taking my time more than I should have, I looked through all the two-handed swords until I found one I considered to be the best. It was the maximum length for a two-hander, but was light and simple, without any senseless decorations beyond a thin foam crossguard. Though I knew my major tactics of running and hiding would remain unchanged, I at least felt like I now had the opportunity to fight. Just as I was leaving, the old man appeared from one of the back rooms. My first instinct was to run, but I just slowly turned around and left, as normally as if it were just any old monster ready to set out on patrol. A moment passed before he called out to me, but by then I was already sprinting towards the safety of the dark woods, sword in hand. Now it was time to plan. The entire time I had been gathering and preparing, I had been thinking of what exactly it was that I wanted to do. There was no point in trying to clear my name, and just surviving until I was caught wasn't really much of a plan. Thinking of what Nephim, my character, would do in this situation, I realized that I didn't really have the choice to get out of this land, especially if you took the real-world consideration that Haradul had been the one to drive us here. I then simply asked what it was I really wanted to do. I really wanted to kill that fat woman warrior. Archduke Ulsik also really deserved to die. In fact, I wanted to see just about every player who had sided with Ulsik in hunting me suffer a bit, but I was more than willing to just watch the noble house of Ulsik crumble. Fantasizing about seeing everyone have their precious characters killed, I quickly realized the difficulty, if not impossibility, of me being able to accomplish something like that. Setting my sights low, I decided it would be best to just focus on having the woman warrior get killed, while antagonizing the Ulsik house whenever I could. This didn't leave me with much of a time frame. It was already Saturday night. The event only lasted until Sunday afternoon, giving me only a few hours to do anything. Every second now had the utmost importance, especially because I never planned on coming back here again. With such a small amount of time to work with, I needed every edge I could get. While just having the sword with me felt comforting, the tiny bit of damage I dealt with it didn't really seem like it would let me accomplish my goal within the time allotted. Though I was certain I could kill the woman in solo combat, I doubt there were ever a time where she'd not be alone without some manner of backup. Combined with my spells, I might have a chance against 2 people, though not if one were a mage. Magic in this game was definitely overpowered, and I think I could understand why. Almost every top-tier noble was a wizard, including Ulsik himself. All the most important battles would be fought between mages and warriors, really only served the purpose of standing between wizards, creating a nice wall for them to cast over. What scared me most about the mages was abilities like Ulsik's Firestorm. While dodging beanbags wasn't easy, you still had the chance. With undodgeable area attacks, the only hope you had was that your character was strong enough to survive. Thankfully, these mages typically dressed like poison dart frogs, making it easy to not only see that they were dangerous, but easy to see from a distance. In order to kill the woman warrior, I'd have to attack her at a time where I could tell there wasn't a mage within running distance, which I doubted would be an easy task. Wondering if there was anything I was overlooking in my character sheet, I fished into my pockets to retrieve it. As I did, my fingers brushed against 2 things I had completely forgotten about. I had removed the 2 magical rings from the treasure box, and never returned them. This was undoubtedly a cause to celebrate. While made out of cheap plastic and set with cheap plastic gems, the real worth of the ring could be determined by a chart that revealed what each type of ring did. Unable to remember the whole chart or even more than a small part of it, I was at least able to determine that the gold and blue gem ring was undoubtedly powerful, but also that the silver and 3 red gemmed ring was most likely unique. Unique rings were ones that were not on the chart, at least not on the chart in the rulebook, meaning that in order to find out what it did, I'd have to ask the plot master. My joy quickly fading, I realized that without knowing what they did, these rings were just cheap pieces of plastic. Even so, I was still glad I had kept them. Slipping them back into my pocket, I began to review my character sheet, only to realize that it was far too dark to make out a single word. Taking a bit of a risk, I moved towards one of the major paths, which had large streetlights placed sparingly among them. Reading my statistics beneath the light, I found nothing I didn't already know. Even so, it was good to actually see what I could do, and I began to formulate what kind of strategies I had available to me. In a somewhat ironic sense, while I mused over how to be tactful and strategic, I was standing out in the open beneath a streetlight. This may have been bad because I was clearly visible and vulnerable, but it was even worse because my eyes were adjusting to the light. As the 2 monsters approached me, I didn't even notice them until it was far too late. They saw me, and didn't even hasten their pace. I called out to them, asking what I saw. One replied that they were murda grunks, and seeing my confusion, the other simply explained that they were stronger grunks. As they walked towards me, their short swords ready, I felt a strange calmness. I felt like a proper, gentlemanly duel, rather than an ambush. I felt like we were all on the same wavelength, understanding that what we were about to do was a battle that would test our physical skill and ability, rather than what our stats dictated. It was to be an honorable, feel-good battle, where no matter who was slain, we'd all congratulate each other on an excellent fight. Just as they leapt to attack me, 3 more of them leapt out of the woods. Cursing, I quickly struck one twice, relying more on the reach of my sword than any actual skill. He fell, making me take the guess that even though they were stronger than ordinary grunks, they were not stronger by much. The other 4 stopped advancing, and spread out to surround me. Were the circumstances different, my principal thought would be to shout and delay them until help arrived. With that being a more deadly option than trying to face these 4, I decided on a plan that may have been even more foolish. Calling out to one, I challenged him. A direct, clear challenge. The other 3 seemed indifferent, ready to just swarm and kill me, but I had chosen the right one. This guy was tall and fairly muscular, very unlike the rat-like creature he was supposed to be. With a few short words, he told the other 3 he could take me, and with a bit of reluctance, they moved away from the 2 of us. He leapt at me, in a way that you were not allowed to do at this LARP. Within the rules, combat was expected to be 2 people standing a few feet away from each other, tapping their weapons at each other until the person who dealt more damage or had more HP won. Jumping at your opponent was not allowed, as it was considered dangerous, and getting too close to a person was likewise prohibited. In that moment, and probably every moment like it, I simply didn't care, and was glad that someone was willing to actually give me a fight. He had charged in close, but too short for the reach of his sword, yet within the reach of mine. I slashed at him, forcing him to block, and tried a second slash before he leapt back. He was skilled, perhaps even more than I was, but both my weapon and my statistics were superior. As he tried to figure out how he could actually strike me with his short sword, I interrupted his thoughts by rushing at him. He was far too good with that short sword, blocking every strike I tried, but the difference in reach kept him from returning any attacks. Finally, I bent down low, striking his legs. It was a solid hit, too low for him to block with his sword, and I quickly followed in with another, felling him. The other 3 had remained silent spectators, but as they saw their comrade fall, they began to make odd, rat-like sounds. I turned to face them, ready for them to swarm me. Instead, another one took a step forward, and with a bit of relief, I challenged him as well. This fight was short. As I likewise discovered, he was a skilled fighter, and he could block my attacks with leisure, but 2 strikes to the legs was enough to defeat him. The third didn't even wait for me to properly challenge him, and I didn't even wait to find out if he was good at blocking. I kept attacking his feet, forcing him to leap back each time. Unable to find a counter, as he reached the edge of the path and his foot fell into a small ditch that was beyond it, I struck him squarely on the shoulder and followed it with a hit to the other side. The last one approached me in a low stance, and I at first thought he was just acting like a rat-like creature he was supposed to be. It didn't take me long to realize he had figured out the counter to my low attacks, and from his low stance, his short sword guarded his legs with ease. I was also pressed with a different difficulty, in that the one target that I had access to was also the one I wasn't allowed to hit. He didn't even bother to guard his head, in a strange form of faith, and I was left trying to slash his sides, only to have my efforts wasted by his blocks. While his stance was good for defense, he had no real way to attack me. His crouch kept him from being very mobile, and we fought in almost the same position for far too length of a time. Seeing that he wasn't even breathing hard, I suddenly felt all the exhaustion the last battles owed me. Gasping for breath, I continued to attack, knowing that each passing moment was just to his advantage. The second I'd stop my attack, he'd rush in, dealing damage that I could not risk to take. With a final, wild swing, I gave up. Too tired and too unskilled, I realized I had no chance of beating him in this manner of fighting. As soon as I saw the opportunity, he leapt forward, his sword flashing out at my shoulder for 2 points of damage. I responded in kind, however, 4 points. With no skill, no effort, nothing but raw statistics, I took his next hit and returned it with my own. There was a mutual feeling of disappointment, but I just could not let myself be killed by a bunch of random rat people. As he dropped, I asked if I found any treasure on them. They handed me 5 copper pieces, a fair amount of money, and then left them as they went to respawn somewhere else. The 2 hits I had taken were bad, but I still had 10 HP left. A bit low for a warrior to have, but I was quickly realizing that I might just not have what it takes to be a melee fighter. Knowing that I had to rapidly learn the style of fighting that took place here, or I didn't even have a chance at accomplishing my goals, I began to wonder if it was time to start seeking fights. I didn't have to, as it was all too easy for the fights to find me. Like most nights, that night had a special theme. Every monster that was out there was either a grunk or a murder grunk, and they were out in full force. The side roads were now just as deadly, if not more so than the main roads, something that took me a few encounters to determine. Fighting against the people who played the monsters was a rare treat for me, and after taking down 6 two-man groups, I realized I was overextending myself in order to keep fighting them. Keeping to the small roads, I kept fighting and fighting, ambushing one group or being ambushed by another. I went out of my way to pick fights, enraptured by what was probably some form of bloodlust. With each enemy carrying a single copper piece, I had a good way to keep track of how many I had been fighting, as I would have lost count otherwise. I, at first, pitied my enemies for having low HP and dealing only 1 or 2 points of damage. I quickly got over that, as my own HP dwindled and I saw that they basically all had infinite lives. I would fight a group, only to fight them again within the next few minutes, knowing full well that I would see them again soon. The battles slowly became easier as I began to recognize people and how they fought, and the monsters seemed to slowly get used to the nature of having infinite respawns. As the night continued, they grew less and less defensive, more willing to do suicidal rushes and risky maneuvers, knowing full well that they just return in a matter of minutes. As time flew by, I began to wonder what exactly I was doing. With only 6 HP left, I had collected over 50 copper coins, half a gold piece, but not having accomplished much else. With the large amount jingling in my pocket, I eventually asked the lone murder grunk I had ambushed and slew if he had any silver pieces he could exchange for my copper. He asked me how many rat people I had defeated by then, and I started counting. Amazed, the murder grunk introduced himself and then told me that he wasn't a monster, he'd play a character named Vlaine. Vlaine explained that the cave right now was basically empty, with every monster running about. They were actually supposed to be assaulting the inn, where all the players were gathered together. However, I had chosen a fairly inconvenient hunting ground for the monsters, as I was right in between the inn and the cave, with only a handful ever actually reaching the end and being killed almost instantly by the high-powered people that guarded it. Most of the rat people were actually preferring to find and fight me, then the journey all the way to the inn. Realizing that I was ruining what was most likely Ulsik's planned event, I couldn't help but feel proud. Thanking Vlaine for the information and for exchanging my copper for some silver coins, I made my way back into the small paths, reinvigorated thanks to having found a purpose. The rat folk changed their tactics. Rather than moving in 2-people groups, they moved around individually, searching for me. While they could have easily defeated me by just moving around in groups of 4 or more, I think I came to realize that their goal wasn't a collaborative one. Each monster wanted to be the lone one who managed to kill me. This made my life much easier, as ambushing them became almost too easy and the subsequent battles were over in seconds. The encounters were now paced closer together, but I grew less and less tired as the night continued, having found a style of attack that worked almost too well. The legs were my favorite targets. The only way they could be defended was from the crouched position or by moving backwards. What this meant was that any time they wanted to move forward, their legs became perfect targets. I would wait for my opponent to take that step forward to attack with his short dagger or sword, and with a step back of my own I would strike his exposed leg, with my fading strike working every single time, no matter how often I used it against the same person. I thought about just how frustrated all the monsters must be. They continued to keep to the small paths I was on, a nearly continuous assault of battles. As soon as I dropped one grunk, I would spot another who had heard the sounds of battle, and I would rush to meet him. With adrenaline surging through me, I continued to fight, slowly learning how to use my sword until I felt that I really could match the monsters in actual skill, not simply cheap tactics and an abuse of my reach advantage. After exchanging coins a few times with Vlaine, who told me the monsters were glad I did so, as they probably would have run out of copper coins. In the 5 hours I had spent fighting, I had managed to collect 2 gold coins and 3 silver ones, an impressive haul by any standards, but the 5 hours had taken their toll, with no healing spells left, only 3 HP, and I could barely move. Thankfully, it seemed that the monsters were too exhausted, and their numbers slowly dwindled until finally I was certain that I was all alone in these woods. Trudging back to the cabin I had commandeered as my own, I opened the door, too exhausted to think. The inside was very dark, far darker than the moonlit night outside, but I didn't want to risk turning on the light. I moved towards the closet that would be my personal sanctuary, ready to pass out. The lights suddenly flashed on and I wheeled around, adrenaline knocking aside any fatigue. Standing by the light switch was the young, nervous girl I had met many hours before, startled and surprised by someone she was clearly not expecting. She must have been either sleeping or waiting in bed, as she was dressed in simple pajamas. With the rules of the game dictating that we were both still active players, I looked at her as a threat. She had no weapons on her, but if she were a pure mage, that meant nothing. With only 3 HP, a single spell would be more than enough to take me out. Not wanting to take that chance, I moved towards her, sword ready. She surrendered, throwing both hands out wide, showing that she didn't even have a beanbag to throw. She then told me that she didn't even have any spells remaining, as she had used them up already. Perhaps somewhat foolishly, I trusted her, telling her to get back to her bed. I quickly turned out the lights and locked the door, only realizing now how stupid I was for not noticing it had been unlocked earlier. She knew who I was, at least. She knew how I was a fugitive murderer with a 30 gold bounty on his head. I told her that all I wanted to do was sleep, and that the closet was the only safe place I had found. I asked if I could trust her to not tell anyone, so that I wouldn't have to kill her. When I said it like that, she told me that there was no doubt that I could trust her. Slumping down into the closet, I waited for my heartbeat to slow, the last bit of excitement having roused it into a rapid tempo. Feeling hungry, I offered her a bag of chips as I opened one for myself. As we ate, she asked me what I had been doing for the last day, and I felt a strange need to tell someone what I had gone through. As soon as I finished, I asked her what she had been doing, and if she had any news that could help me. Her character's name was Selena, and she had come here with her boyfriend. Her boyfriend, much like Hardul, had been here since the very beginning, and was one of the most powerful warriors. He had convinced her to come, though she admitted she was very reluctant. He had built her character for her, telling her that he planned on working with her as a team. She was a mage, but could not use any weapon and only had 7 HP. All her points had been spent in healing spells. He made her into a pocket mage. These 2 words may not mean much to non-LARPers, because it may be something that can only exist in a LARP. While a warrior may be powerful, there was a way that they could be practically invincible. While they fought, they could have a mage with a hand on their backs, constantly healing them. This 2-person combo was so effective, it ended up being the sole tactic used by the most powerful players at the last LARP I had gone to. Fighting against a warrior who had a pocket mage was at best like chopping a tree, trying to get the mage to expend all their spells so you could actually have a chance to damage the warrior themselves. She had followed her boyfriend around all day, healing him and others when necessary, until it came to the big battle that had taken place at the inn. He had underestimated the Grunk swarm, running into the center of one, and ended up having Selena use all of her healing spells. Without her spells, she was effectively useless and opted to go to their cabin. Her boyfriend also wanted to leave with her, but Ulsik kept saying that more and more ratfolk were on their way. Since he had to help defend the inn from the massive swarm that would never actually reach it, the boyfriend had stayed behind. Reaching into my pocket to take out a piece of gold so that I could give her something in exchange for her silence besides a threat, I realized I still had the 2 rings. I quickly asked her if there was any rule book inside this cabin, and she went over to her boyfriend's bag and pulled out a copy. Reading with a flashlight, I found a page with the ring chart. I was impressed by what I had. The gold ring with the blue gem was a ring of minor spell reflection. What this meant was that I could block spells with my sword. Ordinarily, one of the reasons why mages were so powerful was because both the shield and the weapon of a warrior were viable targets for their spells, forcing them to dodge if they wanted to avoid the spell. With the sword and shield being the most popular weapon combo, the shield served mostly as a giant target for the spellcasters. However, with either a sword, shield, or ring of minor spell reflection, neither the sword nor shield counted as targets, meaning you could block spells that came towards you. A major ring of spell deflection actually let you bounce any spell you blocked right back at its caster 3 times a day, but the minor ring was still much more powerful than someone like me deserved. I also determined that the ring with 3 red gems was in fact a unique one, which was at least better than being unsure about it. Placing both rings on my fingers, I thanked Selena, gave her the gold piece and explained that I was using it to buy her silence, and then dug into my small closet nest. An hour later, her boyfriend marched inside, waking me up from my light sleep. He seemed rather angry, and I quickly learned why. He and the rest of the nobles had been staying at the inn, waiting for an ambush they were expecting to come, but only a handful of rat folk ever made their way to the inn after the first initial wave. Ulsik eventually ended up breaking character, calling the cave, and finding out that all the monsters were too tired to go and attack the inn. All the players who had stayed up all night at the inn were furious, having been denied what was supposed to be a fun and easy battle. Selena explained that it had been me and had been fighting hundreds of rat folk, and he quickly demanded to know how she knew. She explained that one of the monsters who was going back to his cabin had told her what happened, and her boyfriend ranted and raved for a little longer before he collapsed into his bed. I returned to sleep, but the urgency that comes from understanding I only had the rest of the day to complete my goals, I woke up after only 3 hours of sleep. If my guess was correct, most of the players would still be sleeping at this time, especially since they had practically spent the entire night guarding the inn. After eating a pathetic breakfast, I looked out of the closet into the cabin. Selena and her boyfriend were sleeping, and what I noticed were separate beds. Looking at the gear her boyfriend had carelessly tossed to the ground, including a clearly magical two-handed sword, I wish vehemently that you didn't need a sanctioned witness in order to steal things. Just as I was about to leave the cabin, a dirty little rule suddenly entered my mind. With the rulebook within reach, I went ahead and made sure I had read it correctly. I read it again to make sure that I had not omitted anything. I then struggled slightly with my decision. Available to all players was the ability to deliver a finishing blow to a fallen enemy. Dropping a monster or a player to 0 HP meant that it had only fallen unconscious, and that it would still take the 15 minutes or so for it to die. However, by delivering a coup de grace, a declared attack that you had to wait 5 seconds before you delivered, you bypassed the whole 15 minutes and just instantly killed your opponent. And the rules made certain to say that this finishing blow could be used on sleeping people, making it possibly the best way to assassinate someone. I wondered at first if I was betraying Selena's trust by murdering her boyfriend while he slept, but knowing that he was from House Ulsik made my decision very simple. With sword in hand, I declared my attack, counted the 5 seconds out loud, and gently tapped his shoulder. I then gently woke him. He did not awaken gently. He knew full well I had done even before I told him. He threw a fit, loud enough to wake Selena, but I calmly showed him the rules I had followed, and told him that he had died in his sleep, not even knowing who had killed him. He had no choice but to accept his character's death, but I knew for certain that when he went back to the end to get resurrected, he'd tell everyone that I had killed him. I then almost ran right out of the cabin, before realizing something very important. I turned to the guy and told him I was taking his stuff. With him being a fallen enemy, he would act as the witness as I looted his gear. He turned to Selena, and he knew better than I did that she had no way to stop me. Emptying a pouch that held over 50 gold and grabbing the two-handed sword, I felt somewhat reluctant about parting with my old sword. I asked him if he wanted to keep the physical weapon, an overly ornate and tacky piece, and he agreed that he'd prefer if I just took the 2 ribbons that told people his sword was both +3 and made of enchanted silver. Hoping my tiny bit of revenge against the noble house would not backfire on me, I ran off, keeping to the smaller paths. I briefly considered going into the cabins and killing other people while they slept. This plan dissolved rather quickly, as within the hour I managed to find 2 people talking at a crossroad. Moving off the path, I listened and discovered that the boyfriend had not even waited to tell people at the inn, but had warned a fellow noble who was now rusing everyone awake. At first, I felt bad that the potential victims were now gone, but I realized this was better for me. They'd be weakened by a lack of sleep, and more importantly, they'd be active, giving me something to do. The 2 people then parted and ran off in opposite directions, leaving me to figure out a plan. Attaching the 2 ribbons to my sword, I could now deal 7 damage, and double damage against creatures weak to silver. Since it was a brand new day, I had my full 14 HP, along with my 1 7 damage fire spell and 3 4 HP heal spells. I felt ready to take on the world. While feeling pretty good about my newfound and restored power, I spotted Vlaine heading towards the cave. Seeing that he wasn't a monster just yet, I went up to him and asked him what he was doing so early in the morning. Vlaine explained that all the monsters were gathering together in the cave, preparing for a huge battle. Questioning him further, he explained that this battle was somewhat unplanned, and was basically being cobbled together because last night's big battle didn't go as planned. While the monsters had their share of fun, the players in the inn felt like they had just wasted their time. The funny part was they couldn't really complain because, in a way, I had been defending the inn, and would be considered a hero in the game. I explained I definitely would not be seen as a hero, especially since I had just killed a noble this morning. Vlaine found this news very amusing. He and most of the people who played monsters all really hated the nobles, and this was really good news to them. My gears turning, I asked for more details about the upcoming battle. This time, they wouldn't just be weak little rat folk. They were going to be various types of giants, including trolls and ogre mages. Vlaine was one of the few monsters who was actually good at casting spells, so he knew that he'd be chosen to play part of an ogre mage. Since he was a mage, he'd probably be put in charge of a small squadron, probably younger monsters. I then told him what I was planning. He stopped me short, telling me that most of the monsters would not agree to doing anything like that, because they knew that a monster's role was not to kill, but to be killed. I felt disheartened for a second, before Vlaine also explained there were definitely a few monsters, if not a few players, who would want nothing more than to help me accomplish my goals. We planned quickly. The huge battle would take a lot of preparation, about 2 hours or so. During that time, Vlaine would talk to some of the younger monsters and he thought would be on my side. He said that was a pretty easy step, since I had managed to get a lot of respect through killing so many rat folk by myself. After that, he himself would go on patrol, using the freedom of being a monster to look for players. He would then lead them to me. Within an hour, there were 6 teenagers sitting around me inside a wooded glen. Asking them a few questions, it became quite clear that they hated the nobles, not just the one from Ulsich's house. They told me themselves that they had heard I had defended the inn, despite being a fugitive, none of them realizing that all I did was stop the nobles from having a chance to show off. Thankfully, whether or not they were trustworthy didn't matter. I explained what I wanted them to do, handing them each a piece of gold. I promised them another if things went as planned. I met up with Vlaine 15 minutes before the big battle was supposed to start, and he said that everything was ready. He even said that he had gone one step further than we had planned and managed to convince a particular person to join us. It was the guy who I had been forced to resort to relying on statistical advantage in order to defeat. After that first battle, where he had figured out to use the low stance to counter my attacks, I received a chance to fight him several more times. He was easily one of the most skilled fighters that was here, and it was only towards the end of that night that I felt like I had grown to be able to fight with him purely by skill. Even by then, though, I felt that we had both been outfitted with the same weapon. I would have lost each time. Vlaine then explained that the man was going to be playing a summoned air elemental, a creature that could walk right past a shield wall just by saying he was flying. This meant that the battle could be very quickly turned into the perfect situation for me. As he ran back to the cave in order to get his costume on, I ran towards the large field where the battle would take place. I moved into the woods that lined the field, preparing a makeshift blind to conceal my position. What I needed to do now was watch and wait until the perfect moment presented itself. The two armies soon gathered at opposite ends of the field. The giants were organized in loose squads and were clearly outnumbered almost 2 to 1. However, that was only in reality. While in the fantasy world there were more giants than there were players. When a giant would fall, he would go back to the edge of the woods, wait a few seconds, and then come back as a new giant. Typically, they had a set number of times they respawn, depending on how strong of a giant they were, with weaker giants respawning more times than stronger ones. However, the number would likely change as the battle went on, as the old man, the battle coordinator, would see how many mages still could cast spells on the player's side. If there were only a handful of mages left, the coordinator would just tell the monsters to stop respawning, and the battle would soon be over. Everything was geared in the players' favor, and there was absolutely no chance that they would lose. The players were organized by noble house. Those who were not part of a noble house were conscripted into one of the duration of the battle. Their strategy was simple. The warriors would form a shield wall, with the mages behind them as support. A few of the noble warriors were already in the front lines, with pocket mages already behind them. They would just let the waves of giants crash onto their shield lines, which would undoubtedly hold. The strong warriors would never fall, because of their pocket mages, while the weaker warriors would just be replaced as they fell. Everything about the battle seemed to have already been decided. I spotted Ulsich safely in the back with a large entourage. Among them I spotted Hardul, Lith, and even Selena, and her newly resurrected boyfriend. Knowing that could turn into a very complicated situation, I hoped that the battle would press the entourage to spread out. As the battle began, the air quickly filled with shouts. The nobles shouted orders at the other players, while the giants simply shouted. I watched intently, seeing the players shift around, until I saw what I was looking for. 6 players with shields, forming a line, were directly in front of Vlaine's squad of giants. I stood up and walked out of the forest behind the player's forces. Vlaine, who had been fighting lazily, spotted me, and with a great shout, lifted his staff into the air with both hands. Responding to a signal, the 6 players moved out into the sides, forming a massive gap directly in the center of the shield wall formation. Ignoring these 6, Vlaine and his squad marched right past the shield wall, striking down mage after mage. It all happened in an instant. The scripted battle with its foretold conclusion turned into absolute chaos. The players tried at first to close the gap, but the other monsters knew an advantage when they saw one. They poured into the gap, striking the almost completely defenseless mages, dropping one after the other. And with no healer support, the front line began to crumble, and complete rout seemed likely. That was until Ulsic and the other nobles decided to step up. With a single spell, Ulsic obliterated Vlaine's entire squadron, stopping the spearhead formation that he had managed to create such a large gap. As he continued to throw spells with abandon, the other knights began activating their special abilities. Some became invincible, others exploded in damage, and one managed to revive 10 of the mages who had fallen. The battle quickly turned against the giants, who were pressed back until the shield wall re-established itself. I watched all this with anticipation. No one seemed to notice me, or at least they didn't seem to care about me. No one except Lith. As soon as he spotted me, he knew my intentions. He moved towards me, away from Ulsic, and confronted me. There was no point in words. This wasn't a matter that concerned House Ulsic or this game. All that matters was this rematch, a moment for Lith to restore his lost honor. As he moved towards me, I threw an ice spell at him, hoping to pin his legs. Without flinching, he simply replied, "Minor immunity," and continued forward. This was fine by me. Being immune to all low-level spells, which were all of my spells, made this into a straight sword fight. The only thing that irked me was that it was most likely Ulsic who had cast it on Lith, but even that meant one less spell Ulsic could cast today. We were a bit of a distance away from the rest of the battle, and while I desperately needed to pay attention to it, I couldn't afford to. Lith was earnestly trying to kill me, and this time I was ready to respond in kind. He had not been through what I had been through. His sword was slow in comparison to the daggers I had faced, and his shield seemed to trouble him more than me. My sword sang, slicing through the air and then into his leg, and again into his shoulder. He was shocked when he heard me call out 7 damage, and now he was at best 2 hits away from dying. He didn't say a word though, and charged forward, slamming me with his shield. I fell back, not expecting this illegal strike, but complimenting him on his willingness to use it. He wasn't holding anything back, and I was glad that he decided to take this so seriously. As he tried again to slam me with his shield, I used all of my strength to whip my sword into his, disarming him and tossing his sword away. I followed with a blow and a light tap to his shoulder before letting him pick up his sword. 3 times 7 was 21, while he only had started with 22 HP. With his single health point left, I decided to remind him of our earlier battle by telling him to run off to the inn and find a healer. These might have been some kind of magic words. As soon as I said them, he shouted, threw down his shield, and leapt at me with his sword, leaving his front leg exposed. With a perfect, fading strike, I dealt the 7 damage to his leg before stepping out of the way of the blow that was assuredly aimed at my head. As soon as I delivered the damage, he just smiled. "That was a good fight," he said simply, before dropping ceremoniously to the ground. Moving past him, I saw that our fight had not gone unnoticed. Selena, attached to her boyfriend, were heading my way. This was not a fight I wanted to deal with, especially not when I was supposed to be paying attention to the bigger battle, but the boyfriend was not going to let his assassin just walk away. He came in swinging, and I wondered how he had survived in this game. He swung his 2-handed sword almost as if the sword was swinging him. Realizing that he was the first player I was going to fight after going through all the monsters and even Lith, I didn't feel as much joy as I did a sense of tedium. As I struck him again and again and again, wondering how he expected to hit me, he was calling out 12 points of damage with each strike, but I was not worried in the slightest. After hitting him 10 times, he called Selena over to heal him. As she did, I asked her if she could save a heal spell to heal Lith. As she agreed, her boyfriend grew furious, which made his attacks all the wilder. Ignoring every rule, he seemed intent on chopping off my head with his silly-looking sword. I kept attacking him, until I had hit him another 10 times. After Selena healed him again, she then ran off towards Lith, leaving the 2 of us alone. Without restraint, I whipped my sword into him, literally shifting him left and right with each blow until he simply dropped. Picking up his sword and seeing no ribbons on it, I just tossed it away from him to give him a little trouble if someone decided to revive him, but not wanting to use a finishing blow on him to kill him outright. As I surveyed the battle, it seemed like the player's shield wall was doing its job, and the giants were in a bad situation. Spotting Vlaine, I waved my sword at him. With another shout and a raise of his staff, the shield wall once again parted. The chaos returned. Looking on in satisfaction, I turned to look at Ulsik, who now had a worried look on his face. As I stood there, basking in this moment of despair, I was struck hard in the back of my head for 12 points of damage. Turning around, I saw the boyfriend standing there, and I looked around for any sign of a healer. With none that could be found, I realized what he had done. He had dropped to the ground while he still had HP left, only pretending to have fallen. Thanks to the naivety that allowed me to fall for such a simple trick, I had only 2 HP left. I don't think I really cared about how much HP I had at that moment. With the back of my head throbbing slightly, I struck him hard in the hands, not even bothering to call out damage. As his sword dropped slightly, I began to rain down hits on his shoulders. He dropped after only 4, but I continued to poke his body until I was sure he had taken over 300 points of damage. To make sure he wasn't faking this time, I then performed a coup de grace, and watched as he stood up and ran off the battlefield. Looking around, I saw that everyone was preoccupied with the giants. The hole in the shield wall was no longer closing, and it was hard to tell if there were any mages left standing besides the strongest of nobles. Looking towards Ulsik, I saw Hardul standing close by him, fending off trolls with his fire spells. Finally, I saw what I had been looking for. Ulsik made a very specific motion, a sideways chop that he continued to do until the old man in charge of the monsters began to move around and issue new orders. Ulsik was low on spells. As soon as that signal was sent out, I sent an identical one at Vlaine. Rather than raising his staff with both arms, he raised it high with one and shouted, calling forth the air elemental. Even when dressed up and acting like a rat person, he had been intimidating. Now dressed in a tattered gray cloak, dark gray makeup, and a grizzled gray wig, carrying 2 huge foam sickles, his appearance was more than enough to drain what little hope the players had. The air elemental ripped people apart, carving a line through the players as they dropped before his sickles. The nobles panicked. The warriors had long lost their pocket mages and were relying on their own HP. The mages had used all their most powerful spells and were using up their items as if they actually feared for their lives. Ulsik, though, looking somewhat stressed, appeared to be still capable of flinging spell after spell, dropping down giants. Finally, as the air elemental drew near to him, he called out a death spell, slaying the elemental instantly. With that, he stopped casting. I moved forward, knowing that now was my chance. Using my 3 healing spells, I returned to 14 HP. I looked to see what was left of House Ulsik, and was pleased that only Hardul and Ulsik himself had not fled back to the inn or were lying face down in the grass. The other noble houses were preoccupied with the remaining giants, leaving me and them apart from the rest of the battle. As Ulsik spotted me, his tiny eyes grew wide. Looking at my hands, he pointed at me, shouting, "The ring! He has the ring of wish!" Looking down at my finger at the piece of cheap plastic I had completely forgotten about, I realized why he had placed such a large bounty on my head. Ulsik probably didn't care in the slightest about me being free. What he cared about was the unique ring I had taken from the chest, and if he cared about it that much, my only guess was that it was obscenely powerful. Putting the matter aside, Hardul stepped in between us, throwing his 10 damage spell at me. I blocked it easily with my sword. He looked at me strangely at first until I showed him the ring I had. He continued to throw spells at me, forcing me to dodge and block with a precision I did not expect from him. Though I tried to get close to him, he kept forcing me back with a nearly endless amount of spells. As I tried to follow his eyes, I suddenly saw him glance behind me. Turning around slightly to see, I saw Lith, his sword ready. Sandwiched between my 2 friends, with my truest goal just beyond them, I realized everything was for nothing. As Lith attacked me, Hardul threw spells at my back, forcing me to dodge and roll just to stay alive. Finally, as Lith managed to catch my sword between his sword and shield, Hardul hit me with a spell for 10 damage. Even so, I knew that if I could just drop Lith, I still had a chance. Ulsik stole that from me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him throw a beanbag at me. Instinctively, reflexively, without a single thought in my head, I batted it with my sword. As I connected with it, I could only scream with rage when I realized what that terrible, horrible man had just cast. Shatter. It dropped. My no longer existent sword. The sword that had brought me all this way just as Lith swung at me for 4 damage. I dropped, slowly, painfully, wondering if they would just let me bleed dry or if they'd finish me off. My face in the dirt, I could feel tears welling up, knowing that I had been so close, yet I couldn't even hit Ulsik once. Ulsik was hysterical. He ran up to Lith and Hardul, hugging them and complimenting himself on his brilliant final spell. He laughed at me, telling me I had been foolish to oppose him, and that he had saved that spell just for someone like me. He promised both Hardul and Lith peerage, not even joking that after this battle there would probably be a lot of vacancies. Hardul, overjoyed, asked Ulsik if it had really been his final spell that had finished me off. Ulsik laughed, saying that he was bone dry out of magic, and was right now nothing more than a walking sack of HP. What luck, he said, that it was his last spell that had taken me down. With the truest ring of happiness in his voice, Hardul said he waited 7 years for this. Hardul often made bad decisions. That's who he was. Left to his own devices, he will almost always come up with the absolute worst ideas, and thinking reasonably, logically, this probably was his worst one. He started casting spells at Ulsik. Lith didn't miss a beat, swinging his sword in a flurry. Ulsik, absolutely bewildered, first tried to understand what was going on. When that failed, he tried to run, but I doubt the man had ran in the last 30 years. Hardul and Lith chased after him, but didn't have to run far before Ulsik dropped. As I watched, wide-eyed and shocked from the ground, I suddenly felt a hand at my back. Selena healed me for 4 hit points, and with a word of thanks, I leapt up. Rushing over to where Lith and Hardul was standing over Ulsik, mouth gaping open, I looked at Hardul as if he had just gone mad. He looked at me as if he planned to do this for years, smugger than a Cheshire cat. I knew full well that he had spontaneously decided to kill Ulsik when he realized he no longer had any power. Lith as well, whose true allegiance remained unknown, if he ever had one, tried to act like he had been the one guiding me through all this. Selena walked over to us, smiling for a reason I doubt I'll ever understand. Beyond her, it seemed like everyone was still more interested in killing the remainder of the giants than to notice that we had just slain one of the most powerful players in the game. One man did notice, though. The old man in charge of the monsters ran over. Looking down at our feet, he asked how much time had passed. Lith, with a sudden realization, bent down and began the coup de grace procedure, as normally as if he were just bending down to tie a shoe. The man just stared in shock. Before he noticed the ring on my finger, ignoring the pretend murder happening right in front of him, he gasped as he asked what I was doing with the ring of wish. I told him how I came across it and asked him what he did. He said it was one of the most powerful items in the game, with the power to grant its bearer a single wish. I knew what my heart desired, or at least what my character's heart desired. I doubt anyone in the circle, omitting Ulsik, would have stopped me. I guess the one good thing about people that were easy to hate is that you were rarely alone in hating them. I asked the old man if I could wish someone's character to be dead forever. The old man laughed, saying there was no need, as characters could only die a certain amount of times that decreased each level. And Ulsik was the highest level character in the game. With a bit of disappointed, I removed the ring, tossed it at Hardul, and went off, back into the woods to be a fugitive. A little while later, it was time for the event to end. Ulsik, who was supposed to proceed over the closing ceremonies, could not be found. Instead, the old man told us what an amazing event it was, and how the players had just barely managed to turn back the most fearsome horde to ever attack. Solemnly, he then began to list the people who had died permanently, sacrificing themselves for the good of all. 14 people, an astonishing amount, had permanently died. 12 had been nobles, and 6 of them had been from House Ulsik, leaving only 1 alive. With a grave tone, he also said that Archduke Ulsik had mysteriously been killed by assassins, though everyone shot a glance at our table. After a moment of silence, he continued on with the ceremony. After everything was cleaned up and packed into the cars, we chatted with some of the people before we left. Very few approved of what we had done, but that was more than fine, since it helped us know which people were miserable and which ones weren't. Vlaine said he really hoped to see us here again, or perhaps we could start a tabletop campaign. The guy who had been the air elemental was also fairly cool, saying he really wanted to fight against me again. Every teenager there thought that we were the 3 coolest guys they had ever met, and all of them wanted to be a part of the newly formed House Cerberus. Selena seemed interested in joining in on Vlaine's tabletop campaign, and we managed to exchange email addresses before her boyfriend, whose character could never be resurrected, grumpily dragged her away, berating her for hanging out with the regicidal maniacs. Ulsik or the man formerly known as Ulsik, when he finally appeared, tried to smile and laugh and accept his death in a noble fashion, but our grins were almost too much for him to take. He ended up finding consolement in the fat warrior woman, who I had completely forgotten about until I heard her name in the list of people that had died. She looked at me with absolute disgust, and I relished in her revilement. As we drove home, Hardul explained that he had always hated Ulsik, and half the reason he wanted to be a noble was so that he could eventually kill the man. I half believed him, but was more willing to believe that he just had a "wouldn't it be awesome if" thought and ran with it. Lith was glad that Hardul had wished to start a noble house, and was more than happy to remind me that he had been the one that dropped me in our third and final battle. Then they asked me my story, which took the entire rest of the card ride to tell. I don't know if I'll ever go back. More likely than not. Ulsik would use every bit of his power just to try and ruin my day if I ever returned, but I would be lying if I said I didn't have fun. And while there may have been more bad times than good, I was still glad I had gone. And maybe if the other two decide to go, I'll tag along.